All right. I am so stoked about today's episode with Dr. Tim Stratton, my buddy. And this is a guy that I am excited for you to interact with on today's live. And feel free to post your questions in the feed, and we will be talking with you. Tim Stratton is also Dr. Tim, as he's got his PhD in systematic theology. His work has been primarily around Molinism, and we're going to really unpack some of this today. He's the president and founder of Free Thinking Ministries. And for many of you who have thought for a while about this whole conversation of Calvinism versus Arminianism, Tim Stratton is going to present to us today another alternative that might help answer some of the questions that you have. Maybe you're unsettled as a Calvinist or an Arminian, and you're looking for a nice way to further understand God's knowledge, our free will, God's sovereignty. Well, Tim's going to put that together for us today. Tim is a one-time, I should say, he was in the past a professional mixed martial artist, but he still can do some good old-fashioned butt kicking. And I had the privilege to go to Israel with this friend of mine about a year ago. We had a great time with a group of other apologists. Please welcome a friend, a scholar, Dr. Tim Stratton, to the show. What's up, Tim?
Hey, Bobby. How you doing, man?
Man,
I lost you.
Oh, we just lost Bobby. He just jumped off for some reason. So,
well, hey, Tim.
Well, hey, Tim. It's good to see you. Fantastic. Yeah. How's it going with you? Let me add myself to the stream here real quick. Oh, here he is. He's coming back in. Hold on. There we go. He's added back in. Let's get him going back here.
Yeah, I couldn't see Tim. Is Tim up now?
Yep.
All right. What's up, Tim?
Well, am I up? I don't see me, and I don't see you. I only see the other Tim.
Yeah, that's what I had happening a little bit ago. So.
Yep, you guys are both up and rocking and rolling.
All right. Well, I don't see anybody, but I'll just trust you.
Tim, can you help Tim get to where he sees us? Because he's looking at a blank screen. I can see both of us now.
Tim Stratton, try refreshing your page there real quick.
All right.
And Tim Hull, I don't know how much people caught before I got lost because I couldn't see either of you guys. Do I need to redo my intro?
Nope.
Okay.
As soon as he came in, that's when you jumped off. So.
Okay.
There you go, Tim. Can you see us now? Yep, the audience is saying it looks good to them.
Yeah, it looks good to me too. Okay, so Tim, can you hear me? I don't even think he can hear us now. So everybody who's listening right now, I thank you for your patience. You're awesome. And it means a lot. I hate all this tech stuff. I'm terrible at it. That's why we have Tim Hull. But I know that this is not unique to One Minute Apologist. I listen to other YouTubers, and this stuff just happens sometimes. And anyway, Tim Stratton just Facebooked me and said his screen's saying it's waiting for the host.
Oh, yep, he's in.
Okay. All right. So Tim Hull, do we need to reschedule then?
No, he's coming back in right now.
Okay. Good.
Says he's waiting in the green room. Find the guest too. All right, Tim Stratton, can you hear us now?
Can you hear us, Tim?
We can see him. I'm going to message him.
Okay. All right. So for those of you who are listening in the meantime, you're hanging out. So, let's just talk for a moment about a topic. What is something we can dialogue? I'd say if you didn't get a chance to see my interview last week with Dr. William Lane Craig, be sure to check it out. He did a great job. We talked about a lot of good stuff, but really the making of an apologist. And he kind of shared what it was like for him to form as an apologist. And he gave a lot of ideas on. Are you in, Tim? I got a moment of excitement. Anyway, but William Lane Craig's podcast, that was a lot of fun. We do have some exciting stuff coming out. Are you in, Tim?
Yeah, yep, I can hear you, Tim. I can see you, but your audio is pretty choppy.
I can't see anything. I'm waiting.
Try restarting your browser there. What browser are you using?
Well, this has got to be really entertaining for those of you who are watching this disaster unfold.
Well, I mean, we already have questions in the chat for Tim Stratton, so we got to get them on, man. People are already asking questions. So yeah. Close Chrome and then open it back up again with the link.
Think that you could help me to see. Just kidding. I can talk just fine. Oh man. Ladies and gentlemen, let's just chat for a moment. We'll give it a few more minutes, and if not, then we'll just crash this and we'll pick up another time. But anyway, at One Minute Apologist, be sure to check out the recent podcast, as I mentioned, with William Lane Craig and YouTube. Tim's going to be on today. We've got some stuff coming down the pipeline. We've got a mental health crash course, and I'm so stoked to get out doing an apologetic for why we need mental health ministries. That's going to release soon. We've got an evangelism crash course coming out, and right now we're currently, with our short videos, releasing a series on Black Lives Matter movement. It's calmed down a little bit, some of that. It's got a little bit more quiet as of late, but nevertheless, we have 8 videos that will come out in total as it relates to the Black Lives Matter movement. And so, keep your eyes and ears open on that. By the way, if you don't subscribe to Pastor's Perspective podcast, that's a radio show that I do. And so you might not be here in Southern California. It's nationally syndicated, but if you don't pick up the program, if you'll subscribe to Pastor's Perspective, you can listen to that. And basically what that is, that's a call-in program that I do with Pastor Brian Broderson. And it's just you're in the hot seat for an hour a day, and people are calling up and they're just asking questions anywhere from Genesis to Revelation. We're talking systematic theology, apologetics, and so on and so forth. So if you have not got that podcast, be sure to check that out as well. Tim Hull, you got an update for me?
He's in. Tim, can you hear us? Check 1, 2. He's coming through, but it looks like he can't hear us on his end.
Okay, so is there?
Oh, he's calling me again. Hold on. All right, Tim, what are you seeing? We're seeing you loud and clear here.
What's that?
I said we're seeing you.
Are you really?
Yep.
I don't see guys for host.
That's bizarre.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because we're seeing you. Why don't we do this? Why don't we take 5 minutes? We'll log off and we'll jump back on. So, audience, why don't you go ahead and stick around? We'll jump back in here in about 2 minutes and we'll get things rolling again. We apologize for the inconvenience, and we'll jump back on here in just a second. Live and ready to go.
Okay, well, thank you so much for joining me here at 1 Minute Apologist. I'm Bobby Conway, and I'm excited to have Dr. Tim Stratton as my guest today to talk about mere Molinism. Tim is a personal friend. He's a gifted apologist, a Christian scholar, and he is the president and founder of Free Thinking Ministries. He has his PhD in systematic theology. He got his master's in philosophy from Biola University, and he currently resides in the great state of Nebraska. Let's bring in my brother, Dr. Tim Stratton. What's up, Tim?
Hey, Bobby. How you doing, man?
Doing great, bro. So stoked to have you on this week with me.
Well, it's a pleasure to be on your show because I got to tell you, I learned a lot from you back in the day. Before you knew who I was following your stuff and learned a lot from all of your videos that you made. So thank you for helping to point me in the right direction back in the early days. And that interview, the On Guard series you did with Dr. Craig, I got so much out of that too. So, and I just had a blast with you last year in Israel. I think it was exactly a year ago right now that we were making that trip. And it was just great to get to know you.
Absolutely. Yeah. We had such a fun time being able to be there with a bunch of apologists with national platforms. And here we were hanging out, eating good foods. And I'll tell you, thank you for those compliments for sure, Tim. And I really appreciate your humility, your Christian character. And look, you're a guy that I just need to say straight up, if we're like in trouble and we're hanging out together, I want Tim Stratton on my side. This dude used to be a professional mixed martial artist, and he could do some good whip butt, right? You know what's funny? Speaking about Israel, Tim and I, we joke. We were out at the Dead Sea, and everybody's out there, and you're doing this mudding and stuff, and you're going through this therapeutic, mudding that you're doing and stuff, and,
right?
But everyone's all out there getting pictures. And I was Tim's personal photographer. He was able to pull off some radical poses out there right there.
That's
for
right.
his bride, Tia, right?
Yeah.
Oh, man. That's right. Yeah. So I told Tim, he reaches out. So any kind of attire that I need to be aware of for coming on set today, I said, you know what, bro, we're just going to go shirtless today. That's the way we're going to roll. He replies back and he goes, well, that'll go viral. I respond to him, that'll be the last video people ever watch of us. Yeah. Oh, man. Well, Tim, I've loved seeing, I'm commenting on some of your feed with your new book, Human Freedom, Divine Knowledge, and Mere Molinism. It's #1 right now on Amazon. Check it out. Right. There it is. You have been cracking me up in the way that you're promoting your book. Tell our audience a little bit about that.
Well, it started out, I asked my dad. My dad is great with Photoshop. And so I said, hey, Dad, can you make a picture of Doctor Strange from the Avengers reading my book? Because really, when you think about the Avengers Endgame and Infinity War, the way that Doctor Strange uses the time stone to defeat the evil of Thanos, he's really using something quite similar to what we're going to talk about today, which is middle knowledge. And so, and what's interesting is the guy that has developed Dr. Strange's character, Scott Derrickson, is a graduate from Biola University. And I think he majored in philosophy and theology. So he's well aware of middle knowledge, and you could see that he was using it. And so anyway, I thought it'd be funny to have Dr. Strange reading my book, and we could say that Dr. Strange used the time stone to go into the future to read my book since it wasn't yet published. But then he went back and used middle knowledge to defeat Thanos. Well, then everybody, there's people around the world that are sending me memes and images every day of different people reading my book. So I've got today the Mandalorian was sent to me. That'll be out tomorrow. And we've got Captain America reading it, and then we've got Martin Luther nailing this to the doors of Wittenberg, and John Calvin reading the book. And so it's just it's been fun, and I've got a good laugh out of seeing these pictures.
Well, I think it's a genius way to promote a book. In fact, next time I write a book, I'm going to be picking your head on how to promote it that way, because I think it's the best promotion I've ever seen somebody do for a book. So I really appreciate it and congratulate you for having the top spot in philosophy of religion right now with your book. Yeah. And I just wish you all the best, Tim, in what you do.
Well, thank you very much, Bobby.
So let's dive in. Over the past 500 years, as it relates to, divine sovereignty and human responsibility, there has been quite the controversy between Calvinists and Arminians. Yet there's this kind of third way that has went under the radar, but has experienced a renaissance of interest in the time that we're living in. And this is the belief known as Molinism. And you're here to talk to us today about mere Molinism. Isn't that correct?
That's right.
Well, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, well, okay, so,
Or John McCrae would say, what do you mean?
Yeah, that's right. He's awesome. Yeah, so I guess if I was in an elevator, I'd break it down into two simple ingredients. So, mere Molinism entails two key essential ingredients. That's number one, logically prior to God's decision to create the world, our omniscient God knew everything that would happen in any possible scenario he could create. Now, this entails something called God's middle knowledge, at least if God is powerful enough to create a free creature, and even if he never does create a free creature. So that's kind of a mouthful. Let me just make it simple, and I'll just say this. The first ingredient is an omnipotent and omniscient God possesses middle knowledge. So that's the first thing. So if you believe that that God is both omnipotent and omniscient, then I'm going to show you that he does possess middle knowledge. So that's the first thing. God possesses middle knowledge. The second ingredient is that beings created in the image of God, humans, like God, possess libertarian freedom. Now, libertarian freedom can be either the ability to choose between or among a range of alternative options, each of which is compatible with one's nature at a given moment. And in my book, I demonstrate that God and man both possess this kind of freedom. Or it could just simply mean a creature, a human has libertarian freedom if they are not always causally determined by something or someone else. And then I will argue in my book that God has this kind of freedom as well. So let me summarize that. The second key ingredient is that I could just simply say that humans possess libertarian free will, at least occasionally. And then in my book, I'll support that philosophically and biblically. So it's vital to see here that mere Molinism is not necessarily a soteriological system. For people that don't know what that means, it's dealing with issues of salvation. So Molinism isn't necessarily dealing with salvation issues. It's simply a model demonstrating how humans can at least sometimes be free and responsible, and also how God can be sovereign over these free choices and our free thoughts and free actions of humanity. Now, typically, I can get most Christians, if you give me a few minutes with them, I can get most Christians to affirm what I call mere Molinism. You know, if they take that elevator ride with me, or like when we were in Israel, you know how we were on that bus together, a big tour bus with all these philosophers and apologists, and we'd, sit next to different people all the time. And, and I always said, you give me just a few minutes with you, I can probably get you to affirm mere Molinism. So I can get most Christians to do that. But the big debate then is over if we should apply mere Molinism to salvation issues or not. And I love to have that conversation too, but in my book, I really try to build a bridge between Calvinists and Arminians and show them that we can all be mere Molinists together. So you can be a 5-point Calvinist and still affirm mere Molinism. And you can be an Arminian and still affirm mere Molinism. And then, then Arminians and Calvinists can debate if they should apply mere Molinism to salvation or not. I do, but hey, if you don't want to, I'm cool with that. So anyway, one can move beyond mere Molinism and apply these two essentials to salvation issues or soteriological issues. But I say that's not necessary. But if you do that, then I call myself a soteriological Molinist because I affirm one more ingredient. So you've got God has middle knowledge, humans have libertarian freedom, and then if you affirm number 3, that God is a maximally great being who loves and desires the best for all people, then or simply God is omnibenevolent, then I say if you affirm all 3 of those, then you are not just a mere Molinist, you're a soteriological Molinist. But I'll just say that a soteriological view of Molinism entails each of those 3 ingredients, but competing views will deny at least one of those three vital points. For example, there's open theists out there and simple foreknowledge folks who deny that God possesses mental knowledge of possible worlds within his power to create. And then Calvinists and other divine determinists, what I call exhaustive divine determinists, regularly reject the notion of human libertarian freedom, and they often dismiss the omnibenevolence of God. And I name names in my book. And I show how some Calvinists, at least inadvertently, if not explicitly, reject at least one of the omni attributes of God, either God's omnipotence, omniscience, or omnibenevolence. And they reject the maximal greatness then of God, even if they don't intend to do so. Most of them don't try to do it, but I show that they are doing it with what they're saying. And I say, look, we cannot do such a thing. We cannot diminish the glory of God. And if you're, I say, in fact, if one's interpretation of Scripture leads him to conclude that God is not maximally great, that he's not either omnipotent, omniscient, or omnibenevolent, then we can know that he has misinterpreted Scripture. And I like to say it this way, I have a very high view of Scripture, but I have an even higher view of God because I have a maximally great view of God. So with all that said, in the last chapter, I show how mere Molinism, and sometimes even how soteriological Molinism, is significant for Christians who take apologetics seriously. And, those who read my book will see that at least one of the two essential ingredients of mere Molinism, and sometimes that third ingredient also, is connected with multiple apologetics-based arguments, what Dr. Craig refers to as the cumulative case. And so with that in mind, it seems that Molinism has logically consistent access to so many more arguments for the existence of God, not to mention offering powerful defenses to objections raised against the existence of God, like the problem of moral evil, the problem of natural evil, the problem of gratuitous evil, and I know even the problem of divine hiddenness. Molinism has access to defeating those objections raised against the knowledge of God, and does a better job of handling these things more than any other view of God's sovereignty. In fact, I don't think these other views can do it. So while this does not deductively prove that Molinism is true, I do have other arguments that deductively prove that much. But just being Molinism making sense of all the, the cumulative case of apologetics arguments, that doesn't prove that Molinism is true, but it does kind of show that it should probably be a preferable view. So I don't know. I kind of went off there. Does that make sense?
No, that's great. And I appreciate you setting the table for this feast that we're going to share together. I do want to say, Tim, on the other side, that now I'm experiencing the tech challenge because ever since we started the conversation, you're frozen on a screen. So
Oh, no.
If there's anything in my eyes that look like they're not as connected to you, it's because I can't read your movements. I can't read your eyes. I can't even see what's happening right now. I'm just listening. So it's unfortunate. For those who are watching this right now, just know that I can't see Tim. I'm just in an audible state, and we'll go with it. But I did want you to be aware of that. How are you doing on the other side? Can you see me talking?
Yeah, I can see you and I can see me and you're moving.
Okay. Well, good. Well, that's all that matters. I'm just going to listen my way through this conversation. You mentioned Dr. William Lane Craig a moment ago, and we're talking about your book again as we're setting the table for Molinism. And here you kind of talked about the two conditions that you can be a Calvinist and Arminian and kind of say, hey, I'm a mere Molinist. But then you kind of brought in the third condition of God being maximally great. And I really love the way that you expounded that and really helping us to understand what that entails. We're going to unpack that. But before we do, I wanted to read a statement, an endorsement from William Lane Craig, somebody that we both look up to. He said this about your book, Tim: "For years, I've hoped to see someone take my work, expand upon it, make it their own, and run with it. This is exactly what Dr. Stratton has done in Human Freedom, Divine Knowledge, and Mere Molinism. Stratton makes a systematic case for mere Molinism by examining scripture and history while appealing to metaphysics and perfect being theology. The final chapter, connecting Molinism to the cumulative case of apologetic arguments and addressing the problem of evil, is worth the price of admission alone. Isn't that really encouraging, Tim?
Oh man, that blew my mind when Dr. Craig first told that to me, and you just got to say that Dr. Craig is my hero, and for him to give my book that kind of endorsement made this entire project that took several years, made it all worthwhile. So thank you, Dr. Craig, for your endorsement.
Absolutely. Boy, it's just amazing what his scholarship has brought about. Just the things that he has kind of helped with the Kalam cosmological argument and Molinism and abstract objects and just the kind of things that have just gotten great traction. It's incredible. Tim, why can't these other views of God's sovereignty work? And I guess, what is the problem that you're trying to solve in your book?
Yeah. Okay. Well, the other views of God's sovereignty. Let's start with Calvinism. I used to.
By the way,
yeah.
Yes. Were you going to say you used to be a Calvinist?
Yeah.
Okay. Then let's talk about that just for a moment as you enter, because I used to be a 5-point Calvinist too, Tim.
Yeah. Right. We had some good talks about that. So yeah, I used to be what I called a hardcore cage stage Calvinist for many years. In fact, I didn't just merely affirm all 5 points of TULIP, right? The famous 5 points of Calvinism. I went even further and affirmed ED, or EDD, which is not necessary, but quite common for Calvinists to do. So let me describe ED. Calvinism is often reduced to what I describe as exhaustive divine determinism. So that's your ED, your EDD, exhaustive divine determinism. And that's a view that God exhaustively causes and determines in one way or another all things, everything that happens, every event. And now here's the deal. If all things really means all things, then this would include all the thoughts, actions, beliefs, and behaviors of all people all the time. So every single thought in your head, every word in your head, and every action that follows is ultimately caused and determined by God on this view. So yeah, that was the view that I affirmed. In fact, I called myself a cage stage Calvinist, and that means I was ready to fight on this issue with anybody, anywhere.
Like most Calvinists, right?
Right. They call it cage stage because it's better to be in a cage than to be let loose out in public when you're that excited about Calvinism. So I used to be this hardcore Calvinist, and as you can imagine, though, this rightly leads many to conclude that if God is causing and determining all your thoughts and beliefs and actions and behaviors all the time, well, this leads many to conclude that if the view of Calvinism is true, then God is ultimately the author of evil and the one who forces the majority of humanity to suffer into the eternal fires of hell, for all eternity and into the infinite future. And I do think this is a logical outworking of the view, and I explain this in my book. So this doesn't, it doesn't seem like, when you think about that, if God is causing and determining the Holocaust, or causing and determining Ted Bundy, or fill in the blank with any evil, and let alone causing and determining the vast majority of humans to suffer into the infinite future of hell, that doesn't really seem like the omnibenevolent God who is love, according to 1 John 4:8, that Jesus claimed to represent, or the God who desires all people to be saved in 1 Timothy 2:4, and the God who desires no one to perish in 2 Peter 3:9, or the God who so loved the world that whosoever, right, in John 3:16. So this leads many to choose the second option, that simple foreknowledge view that's commonly referred to as Arminianism. I don't think necessarily needs to be Arminianism, but I would say that often those who call themselves Arminians are holding the simple foreknowledge view. Now, this view gives humans the freedom to choose to sin or not to sin, and also humans the ability to choose our individual eternal destinies. So this view gets God off the hook, as it were, for the evil deeds humans freely choose to commit. Now, that's the good news that this view offers, but the bad news is that this simple foreknowledge view also seems to relieve God of his providence and sovereignty. I mean, after all, think about it. If God simply and merely foreknows the future free actions of creatures, well, how is he in any legitimate control over the future free actions of creatures? Just because you know how a person will freely choose in the future, that doesn't give you any kind of control or predestination that the Bible talks about, or sovereignty over it. So yeah, I mean, the Bible is clear that God predestines things. Not only is God sovereign, but he predestines not only the elect to heaven, so we could see in Galatians 1:15, but that God is provident over all things. Romans 8:28, Ephesians 1:11, those are good places to start. But here's the deal. If God predestines all things to happen, then how could this simple foreknowledge view of Arminianism be true? Now, I think Arminianism is close, but close only counts in horseshoes and hand grenades or something like that. So, in fact, in my book, I show that some scholars actually think that Jacobus Arminius was a closet Molinist. Some scholars disagree with that, but there's debate there. But what's not under dispute is that his followers, known as the Arminians, they did not understand middle knowledge. Some people think Arminius did. He wrote about it. Molina's writings were in his library. He was quoted by Arminius. So Arminius himself might have been a Molinist, maybe not. But the Arminians clearly didn't understand middle knowledge, and thus the Synod of Dort was dealing with the Arminians. And I would say then, and I explained this in my book, I think the Synod of Dort really attacked a straw man and not the real thing. But I spend multiple chapters on history of thought, from Augustine to Aquinas to Calvin and Luther and Melanchthon, and to Arminius and obviously Molina and the Synod of Dort, and even all the way to Jonathan Edwards. So I just encourage people to read my book. If you're a history buff, you're going to like that part of it. So,
yeah, even if John Calvin had the opportunity to hang a little bit with Molina, you kind of feel like he could have cleaned up some of his thoughts. I've heard you say before.
Right. That's exactly right. And in fact, I use Calvin's own words. I use Luther's own words. I use Philip Melanchthon's own words to support mere Molinism. So I do think if they could have all been in the same room together back in the day and hashed this out, I think they would have at least all become mere Molinists. The only one who wouldn't was post-Reformation, on my view, and that would be Jonathan Edwards. So I think oftentimes today Calvinists are more enamored with the views of Edwards than they are with Calvin or anybody else in the Reformation. So I think it seems to me that Edwards was a pretty staunch Ed guy, an exhaustive divine determinist. But I show why his view, why Edwardsian compatibilism even, it does not work. And I make a couple different arguments in my book against Edwards' view. But I think Calvin and Luther and Melanchthon and the Reformers, yeah, I really do. I try to make a case that they would be mere Molinists.
Tim, as one who is on the side of really wanting to emphasize the sovereignty of God, as a 5-point Calvinist in my past, I've told you that the way I walked out of it is I started getting uncomfortable with some of the logical conclusions that I was thinking about as it related to God. And David Baggett, in his book, Good God, really helped with Jerry Walls to
Mhm.
help me to cement that I was walking away from Calvinism with this whole concept: if A, then B. If A implies I ought to believe, then B implies that I can. But if A implies I ought to believe and B implies I can't believe, then how in the world am I really morally culpable if I can't respond? And so I know as a Calvinist, I would go out and I'd preach the gospel and I'd say, hey, whosoever will can believe, but it wasn't like they really genuinely could. And I feel like
Right.
looking back at my season of being a Calvinist, number one, I would use straw mans on the Arminians. So it'd be like, for example, if you say you place your faith in Christ, then you're contributing to your salvation. Well, that's stupid. Like, no, Arminians don't really think that. That's a straw man argument that we would say as Calvinists to make us feel good in our Calvinism, but no Arminian really thinks they're contributing to their salvation. Then the other thing is it related to the if A implies I ought to believe, B implies I can believe. That resonated. But if I can't believe, then I thought, wow, Christianity is starting to sound like Allahism. Fatalism, like I realized that I wanted to emphasize, and I think many Calvinists do, which is great. We want to talk about how sovereign God is, but I think that we've overdefined the word into fatalism, and we have to redefine what we mean by sovereignty. And so we got to get down to some definitions, and I know you'll help us do that today, but I just wondered if you had some of the same experience of fatalism and feeling some of that in your experience.
Oh yeah. I mean, there was times in my cage stage Calvinist stage of life where I would find myself praying for my friends who weren't saved. And I remember praying for this one guy that I used to train when I was a MMA coach. And I was praying for him one night. My son was just a little guy still. He was probably only 4, 5 years old. He's a senior now. Yeah, so this is back in the day. And I was praying. I was in the other room in my office praying. And, my son was playing video games, I remember. And anyway, I'm praying and I was like, well, why am I wasting time praying for this guy? God knows if he's elect or not. God will either elect him or he won't. He's been elect before the foundations of the world, or he hasn't been. As Calvin said, those who are damned are doomed from the womb. So, I started thinking about those things. I'm like, I don't need to pray. I'll just go play video games with my son. And I did. So, I mean, when I started thinking about the logical outworkings of the view, even with prayer, it actually hindered my prayers. And especially when I started thinking about exhaustive divine determinism, when I stopped praying, I just figured and realized, I should say, oh, well, God stopped me from praying. God made me play video games with my son. Look what God made me do. Look what you made me do. So anyway, because of this, I actually, in the last chapter, at the end of the last chapter in my book, I discuss how prayer works and how Molinism shows that prayer actually makes a difference, and how God can still be sovereign over your prayers, even though you're free and responsible for your prayers. So I try to, in the last chapter, I try to take all this academic, systematic theology and philosophy and bring it down to the streets, if you will, showing how it doesn't just help with apologetics, but how it helps with pastoral issues and just everyday Christian life when it comes to sharing the gospel or praying or, and other things like that. So.
Well, Tim, so far then in the discussion, you seem to have presented us with a dilemma. You once a Calvinist, I once was a Calvinist. We talked about kind of like our exodus. You're sharing with me right now in our audience how Molinism became appealing to you. But it looks like we've got a false dilemma on our hands if we just consider the first two options that you laid out in your introduction. How do we split this, the horns of this moral dilemma that we might find ourselves in?
Yeah. Well, it's, I was raised with those two options. You're either a Calvinist or you're an Arminian. And the way I was raised in my church, my pastor at the time was the hardcore Calvinist. What's interesting, he after I started my journey and left Calvinism, the guy that made me a hardcore Calvinist started talking to me, and we debated about it for years. And guess what happened? Now he's a Molinist, and he actually he works part-time for Free Thinking Ministries now.
That's so cool, bro.
Great guy. But so I would say, yeah, the church has typically has been offered this false dilemma between Calvinism and Arminianism, but there is a view in the middle that splits the horns of the false dilemma. I like to say it's appropriate that a Spaniard is the one who split the horns of this beast. And that is to say, the false dilemma has been defeated by a 16th century theologian from Spain named Luis de Molina. So Molinism. We get the word Molinism from his last name. So Molina offered the model of Molinism, but in my book, I argue for more than just that there's a model. I argue that the model has got to be true through several logically deductive syllogisms that end, I have several that end with therefore humans possess libertarian freedom, others that end therefore God possesses middle knowledge. And then I have other ones that end with therefore mere Molinism is true. And so these are logically valid, structurally valid and sound, logically deductive syllogisms. The same kind of stuff that Dr. Craig likes to offer with the kalam and the moral argument and everything else. And I just applied all of that to this topic. So I had a lot of fun crafting these arguments.
I've enjoyed even today in just taking advantage of some time to be floating around on your website and reading. I do appreciate your logical thinking, Tim. It's orderly, it's precise, it's helpful, and I think it's making a difference right now. And I do want to encourage people to go to Amazon and check out a copy of your book. We're talking about Molinism with the president and founder of Free Thinking Ministries, not mulletism like Billy Ray Cyrus and his mullet, but we are definitely talking about Molinism. Tell us about Luis de Molina and his views, Tim.
Yeah, you bet. So Molinism grounds God's sovereignty not only in his omnipotence as divine determinists solely focused typically, but it also considers God's omniscience. So it's really a view that's dedicated to the maximal greatness of God. And so in my book, I have several sections just where I talk about God's omnipotence, then God's omniscience, and then God's omnibenevolence. And I call these the big three of God's omni attributes. Now, namely, what Molina did was he pointed out, as I alluded to earlier, that since God is all powerful, that he's omnipotent. Think of that, omnipotent. That means omnipotential. God can do a whole bunch of things. God can do everything that's logically possible, right? So that means there's a whole bunch of things God can do, even if God never does them, because, it stands to reason that God has not done everything he has the power to do. But if God is all powerful, then that means he can do a whole bunch of things that he's never done, and probably that he never will do. So that means that God has the ability to create many different possible worlds, including worlds with creatures whom he does not always causally determine. So that is to say that God, being omnipotent, has the power to create beings who possess libertarian free will, even if he never does so. So even if, let's just say everything is causally determined. Let's say that EDD is true. Which I don't think it is, but for the sake of argument, if I were to say, okay, Ed is true, God, exhaustive divine determinism is true, an omnipotent God could have created free creatures, right? Even if somebody doesn't think he did, God could have. He's that powerful. He's omnipotent. So unless somebody can show that there's a logical contradiction there, like saying that God could create a married bachelor, or that Jesus could draw a triangle with four corners in the dirt, whatever. If somebody could show that there's some logical contradiction there, unless they can do that, then it stands to reason that God has the power to create creatures with libertarian freedom. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Since we're keeping God's maximal greatness in mind, if God was powerful enough to create different worlds and free creatures, even if he never does, and since he's also all-knowing, he's omniscient, All right, so we're starting that God's omnipotent, and now we're saying since he's also omniscient, God would perfectly know all that would happen in each of these potential worlds that are within God's power to create. And, if God chose to create them, and even if he never chose to create them. So
Right.
if God knows this, even if he never chose to create free creatures, then he's got middle knowledge. So
Right.
it's vital to understand, because that means that he has this knowledge logically prior to his creative decree. So
Mhm.
that's vital to understand. An omniscient God knows what would be the case if he used his omnipotent power and actualized these possibilities. An omnipotent God would possess even if he never brought these possible worlds into existence. I'll say it this way: God still knows what would have happened if he created any of these worlds within his power to bring into actual existence. So that might get a little confusing for some that have never studied this before. And we're starting to go into maybe some deeper philosophical and theological waters here. So let me make it really simple and just restate it like this. God knows all that would happen in any possible world he could create. Right? I'm going to boil it down to that.
Yeah.
God knows all that would happen in any possible world he could create. So focus on the difference between would and could.
Mhm.
God knows all that would happen in a possible world he could create. So on this full view of God's omniscience, it must include what is referred to as middle knowledge. So the question is raised, what is this kind of knowledge in the middle of? So we've got different moments of divine knowledge that theologians and philosophers like to talk about. So the first one is called natural knowledge, then we've got middle knowledge, and then we've got free knowledge. So natural knowledge just basically boils down to everything that God could do. God knows everything that he could do. Now, since he's omnipotent, that's a whole bunch of stuff, right? And that includes all the things that he's never done.
And Tim, explain possible worlds just for people that might be listening and they're thinking,
yeah,
okay, you're talking about a world of possibilities, but I mean, we're talking in counterfactual terms here too. So if you can, just give our audience a sense of how that's being used.
So we're talking about everything that God could do. So anything he could do, even though he never did it, that's called a possible world, if that helps. Now, if you watch the Avengers, I noted earlier that Dr. Strange used something similar to middle knowledge to defeat Thanos, right? So maybe watching those movies will help. It's not a perfect analogy, but it might help you to start to connect some dots. And so Dr. Strange, if you remember, he uses a time stone to look into like 16 million different possible futures. They use the term possible futures instead of possible worlds. So the 16 million or so different ways the future could be. But, and then they said, well, how many worlds do we defeat Thanos? And he's like, only one of those worlds. So that would then be the best possible world, even if it included a bunch of bad stuff in it too. Or the best feasible world. Anyway, I don't want to get distracted. So anyway, something that God could have done. So think about it this way. God did not have to create at all. He could have just remained in what I call a static state of aseity. Just he was perfectly
for those.
Pardon me?
I was just saying that's self-existence for those who might not be aware of aseity.
Right. He was totally perfectly content as a Trinity. Didn't need to create. Well, if he didn't need to create, then he doesn't have to create. And therefore, you and I exist contingently, and through the grace of God, we exist. We do not have to exist. So a possible way things could have been is that God never creates. Well, that's a possible world. Then we've got the actual world that we live in. Well, that's also a possible world, but it's also an actual world.
Realized.
It's realized, yeah. But God could have created differently. He could have created a universe where humans don't exist. He could have created a universe where Wookiees exist. That's within God's power. He could have done that, right? We don't think that Wookiees actually exist. That would be awesome, right?
That would be cute little dudes.
But those are possible worlds. God could have created a world in which you and I aren't having this conversation right now. So you and I are not having this conversation necessarily, right? Things could have been different. God could have created a world where I'm wearing a a red shirt, or a world in which I have hair, or a world in which unicorns exist, or
Or a world
a
in which
world
I'm
in which
bald.
a world in which my biceps are bigger than yours. He could have done that. So
They are bigger,
anyway,
bro.
those are possible worlds. Yeah. So that's everything that God could do, even if
Mhm.
he never does them. So then you've got middle knowledge that Molina discovered, if you will. And that refers to everything that God knows would happen based on everything he could do. Right.
Mhm.
So that's how I like to explain it.
Yeah, that's
Basically,
helpful.
middle knowledge is referring to what philosophers call counterfactuals of freedom. But I like to summarize that as what would happen if. So God
Yeah.
in his natural knowledge knows everything that he could do, and God in his middle knowledge knows everything that would happen if he
Mhm.
did any of those things that he could do, and even the things that he could do but he never does. All right, God knows all that. And then we have what's called God's creative decree. God makes a decision. After that, after God decides what he's going to do, that he's going to make one of these possible worlds an actual world, boom, now you've got free knowledge. And that means that God knows all that will happen in the actual world. So middle knowledge is, but the reason why it's called middle is simply because it's in between God's natural knowledge and his free knowledge. It's not, some deeper meaning than that. So it's in between. And so basically what I show is, if God is omnipotent and omniscient, then he's got to have this natural and middle knowledge. And then once he makes this decision, he's got the free knowledge, which means that he knows everything that will happen. Now, maybe before today, many of your viewers have never heard of any of these terms before. But again, I'll just make it clear. Natural knowledge refers to everything that God knows he could actualize. All potential situations within God's power to make actual. Middle knowledge refers to the fact that God knows everything that would happen if he were to create a certain world within his power to actualize, and even if he never does. And God's free knowledge means that God knows all that will happen in the world that he's chosen to create, and we call that the actual world. So in a nutshell, if God is always omniscient, then God perfectly knows all that could happen and all that will happen, and he knows all that would have happened in different situations that he could have created. So that is to say, God knows all that could, would, and will happen, and middle knowledge brings the would. So I just tell theologians, you cannot dismiss this would knowledge, this middle knowledge. And that seems simple enough. But the part that often confuses at least the layperson is that it's vital to note that God's knowledge of what could and would happen is what here's some philosophy and theology here. It's logically prior. God's natural knowledge and middle knowledge is logically before God's decision to create the universe, and God's knowledge of what will happen, his foreknowledge in the universe, is logically after, not chronologically after, his creative decree. So that's about as deep into the philosophical waters as I'm going to try to bring your audience today. But I try to really unpack this and explain it more in my book. So if this interests you, or if you're even confused, make sure you go to my book and I'll try to explain it with more clarification, I guess.
And be sure to check out freethinkingministries.com, where there's lots of articles where Tim and his team have put that together as well. Okay, so Tim.
Our YouTube channel too. Just go to YouTube, search for Free Thinking Ministries, and we've got many videos there as well. Yeah,
absolutely. You released that YouTube just a few months ago, didn't you?
Yep. Yeah,
that's great. So Tim, now this kind of, begs the question for us to consider, if God's sovereign over all things, how can humans, be free and, ultimately responsible for some things if God's still just completely, in charge and sovereign? How do we bring in human freedom?
Well, that's a great question. That's $1 million question, and something I really try to focus on. But so before we do that, let's define some terms. So first, the sovereignty of God. That's the doctrine that God is the supreme authority and all things somehow are under his control. Now, the majority of Christians believe that God is somehow sovereign over all things. But the crazy point of contention, and I've described this as cultish or cult-like for some involved in these conversations, is regarding the debate over exactly how God is sovereign over all things.
Mhm.
It really drives me crazy when I see Christians that are so committed to how God is, how God predestines or how God is sovereign. When they're, I mean, anyway, I actually do like how the Westminster Confession of Faith describes the sovereignty of God. Here, I got this here. Let me read it. It says, God from all eternity did by the most wise and holy counsel of his own free will, or of his own will, freely and unchangeably ordain whatever comes to pass. I agree. And in my book, I explain how God can do this without violating human libertarian freedom. So with that said, the next step, once we've got sovereignty out of the way, now we need to define libertarian freedom or libertarian free will. Sometimes it's just referred to as libertarianism. But libertarianism or libertarian freedom is often expressed like this, that they'll say, number one, free will is incompatible with determinism, and number two, some of our actions are free. Now, some maintain that an agent is free in a libertarian sense only if they possess the freedom to think or act otherwise. But it seems to me, however, that if an agent is ever uncaused or not causally determined in thought or action and is simply the source of his or her thought or action, and so even if the agent cannot think or act otherwise for some weird reason, I don't know why, but if they're merely the source, then they're still free in a libertarian sense if they're not causally determined by something or someone else. So I like to say it like this: we can distinguish between the principle of alternative possibilities, that's called the PAP or the PAP, the principle of alternative possibilities. That's commonly referred to as the ability to do otherwise version of libertarian freedom. But then we've got the other version of libertarian freedom that is simply called the sourcehood version or the source version. Now, and that one just simply means you're not causally determined by something or someone else. Now, look, I think both of these views are true. Sometimes both are true simultaneously, and sometimes I'll show that, well, even if someone might not have an ability to do otherwise here, they're still free in a libertarian sourcehood sense. And then I show how this is true for God too. I think sometimes God is free in the sourcehood sense. In fact, he always is. And sometimes God has the ability to do otherwise because he's omnipotent. And then I show how humans created in God's image can have both of these simultaneously. So I guess the sourcehood version of libertarian freedom, well, let me say the PAP, the principle of alternative possibilities or the ability to do otherwise, is sufficient for libertarian freedom. But I don't claim that it's always necessary, but the sourcehood version of libertarian freedom is always necessary, if that makes sense. So I'll say it like this: if I can prove, and I make these arguments in my book, if I can prove that a person possesses the ability to do otherwise, then I have demonstrated that this person possesses libertarian freedom. However, suppose I can't prove that much, but I can, however, show that a person is not causally determined at some point by something or someone else. Well, if I can do merely that much, even if I can't show the ability to do otherwise, then I've still demonstrated that this person possesses libertarian freedom. Now, with all that said, I typically, and not always, like to defend a specific definition of libertarian freedom that I think entails both versions. So when I can, I defend this version. And I'll say that libertarian freedom is simply the ability to choose between or among a range of alternative options, each of which is compatible with one's nature at a given moment. So look, I'm using the word compatible there. The ability to choose between or among a range of alternative options, each of which is compatible with one's nature at a given moment. Now, I won't get into all this probably today, but I really spend a lot of time taking down a view called compatibilism or compatibilistic freedom, which is not libertarian freedom. It's opposed to libertarian freedom. It's I guess it's a thesis that merely says that free will and or responsibility is compatible with determinism. And in my book, I showed that this thesis does not describe reality all the time. It might describe reality on occasion, but I demonstrate how it cannot. This thesis cannot describe the way things are, cannot describe reality exhaustively or all the time. So, but I do say here that the word compatible is in this definition of libertarian freedom. So libertarian freedom is not the ability to do things that are not compatible with your nature. It's simply that sometimes there are multiple things compatible with our image of God nature at a given moment. And I discuss this in more detail in the book.
Okay, so Tim, at this stage, we kind of kicked it off and we talked about how for the last 500 years, since the time of the Reformation, the church in general has kind of lived within two options. You got your Calvinists, you got your Arminians, and they've often just demonized one another. But something that's kind of really experiencing a renaissance through the writings of Dr. William Lane Craig, you and others, is Molinism, this third, and how you split the horns of the dilemma. We needed to define some terms, and you've been unpacking for us some of these important definitions. But I think it's important now that you've kind of taken the time to define yourself, that we kind of get back to the question that I posed at you a little bit ago, and that is this: if God is sovereign over all things, how is it then that humans are indeed, culpable and responsible for some things in their existence here on earth?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think Molinists have an awesome answer. If God has the power and ability to create free creatures, and he perfectly knows how free creatures would freely think, act, believe, and behave if he were to create them, then if God chooses to create them, knowing how they would freely think, act, believe, and behave, then God can actualize a world, create a world where these creatures will freely think, act, believe, and behave exactly as as God knew they would. Let me say that again. If God chooses to create creatures, knowing how they would freely choose, then God can actualize a world where these creatures will freely choose exactly as God knew they would if he were to create them. So think about it this way. Let me use some philosophical language, I guess. I try to avoid this as much as I can, but
yeah, we can tell, Tim.
Well, oh man, okay.
You're doing great, though,
all right.
bro.
What's that?
He said, you're doing great.
Oh, thank you. All right. I'll say it like this. I wrote an article recently on my website called The Freedom to Trick God. So if anybody wants to look at this, but in there, I say that Molinism would entail the following on a categorical ability, a real ability to do otherwise in the actual world. So we'll say that God knows that Sally would, so this is logically prior to God's decision to create anything. So God knows that Sally would freely choose X instead of not X if he were to create her in non-causal deterministic circumstance C. Right? So, so God knows how Sally would freely choose if he creates her in a circumstance where she's got freedom, where she's not causally determined. Then God creates Sally in non-causal deterministic circumstance C. God creates Sally in a world in which she's not causally determined. So if that's the case, if God knew how Sally would freely choose, that Sally would freely choose X instead of not X if he were to create her in this non-causal deterministic circumstance, and then God chooses to create her in this non-causal deterministic circumstance, now God knows Sally will freely choose X instead of not X in this non-causal deterministic circumstance. So here's the takeaway. That might have been confusing, but here's the deal. Just because the word would transforms to will, the word freely does not magically disappear. So again, God knows how Sally would freely choose if he were to create her, God chooses to create her. Now God knows how Sally will freely choose. The word freely is there. All that changes is the word would to will, but freely does not magically disappear. So a lot of people think that we somehow lose our freedom once God creates us with freedom. And that doesn't make sense, right?
Right.
But we have to realize that all that happens is the word would. God knows what we would do if he were to create us. God creates us, and now God knows how we will freely choose. God knows how he would freely choose if he were to create us. He creates us, now he knows how we will freely choose. So if this is the case, then God is not causally determining free creatures because they are free with no causal strings attached or no causal chains attached, So creatures are not caused and determined by God or anything else. They are libertarianly free, at least in the source sense, and seem to have a genuine ability to do otherwise. So at least on occasion. So this middle knowledge view of Molinism splits the horns of this false dilemma by offering a great middle position between Calvinism and Arminianism. And again, it's not necessarily even a soteriological system. So both of these camps have access to mere Molinism. And I'll just say that, like Calvinism, Molinism affirms the biblical truth that God predestines all that will happen, right? The Calvinists and Molinists agree on that. Molinism is clear that God predestines all that will happen, including all that will freely happen in a libertarian sense. And there is nothing outside of God's sovereignty in all of his creation. Molino is clear about that. Now, the Calvinist is going to say amen to that. But like the Arminian, Molinism also affirms and logically explains how that humans possess a genuine libertarian freedom and that humans are genuinely responsible for, at least, that we're responsible for our rational thoughts and moral actions. And although Calvinism and Arminianism both make sense, in my book I say, well, they both make sense of much of the data, of the biblical data, but neither of them seem to be able to explain all the data. But it seems to me that after considering God's middle knowledge, Molinism seems to be able to explain the biblical data from cover to cover. So I think it's a preferable view. I think it's the inference to the best explanation of all the biblical data, historical data, philosophical and metaphysical data, and the theological data. So I just think I think it's true. It makes the most sense of everything.
So Tim, you have mentioned so far, that mere Molinism requires God to possess middle knowledge and that humans possess libertarian freedom. Having said that, we know that the church has been divided over this idea of human freedom for centuries. Here you're presenting, middle knowledge, and you believe that can kind of help bring some closure to this long-standing debate that we have experienced. In your book, you provide, different arguments to help drive home your point, deductive arguments. I would ask maybe you to share an argument. I know that for the sake of time, we've been on for a while, and we want to start trying to, drive home some of these concluding points, but I do want people to see an argument for how this works. So can you take one of these deductive arguments that you've developed and let us see how this pans out?
Sure. I offer multiple arguments in my book, some that's based on biblical data, others that's just based on, metaphysics. But let me give you one that's pretty popular. It's called the free thinking argument against naturalism, and it's 8 steps. So hang with me. It's 4 premises and 3 deductive conclusions and 1 abductive conclusion. So I'll fly through it here. Premise 1, if naturalism is true, the immaterial human soul does not exist. 2, if the soul does not exist, libertarian freedom does not exist. 3, if libertarian freedom does not exist, then it's impossible to rationally infer and rationally affirm knowledge claims. 4, it is possible to rationally infer and rationally affirm knowledge claims. 5, therefore, libertarian freedom exists. 6, therefore, the soul exists. 7, therefore, naturalism is false. And 8, the best explanation of the existence of libertarian freedom and the soul is the biblical view of God. Now, steps 5, 6, and 7 are all deductive. So, I like to really focus on those. But I'll defend the premises here very quickly. Again, this is if I was in an elevator. I think I could defend these quickly. Premise 1 is synonymous with, if naturalism is true, nature is all that exists. That's straightforward and true by definition. Premise 2 is tantamount to, if all that exists is nature, then all that exists, including everything about humanity, is causally determined via the laws of nature, the initial conditions of the Big Bang, quantum mechanics, things outside of human control. Well, premise 3 communicates the fact that if something outside of human control causally determines you to affirm a false belief, then it would be impossible for you to infer or affirm a better or true belief. So here's the deal. If our thoughts and beliefs are forced upon us and we could not have chosen better thoughts and beliefs, then we're simply left assuming that our determined thoughts and beliefs are good, let alone that our beliefs are true. So if that's the case, then we could never rationally affirm that our beliefs really are the inference to the best explanation. We could only assume it, and that assumption would not be up to you either. It would be up to something or someone else that causally determines you to make that assumption. So here's the significant.
This sounds a little bit like Plantinga's argument, like from his book, where the which book am I thinking of? Yeah, where the conflict
really lies.
Yeah, where the conflict really lies. I mean, it's pretty devastating when you think about some of these premises as you're bringing out.
Right. It's very similar. I do quote from Plantinga in my book, and I talk about his evolutionary argument against naturalism. But then, the thing is, I think the free-thinking argument against naturalism is a little stronger because on the evolutionary argument against naturalism, what Plantinga does is he shows, well, look, if naturalism and evolution is true, then human beliefs aren't aimed at truth. They're aimed at survival. And that's much different than truth. So now we don't have, we lose, we have a defeater against our beliefs, if that's true. Well, look, some have argued though, and they'll say, well, look, if my beliefs are aimed at survival, you'll probably survive better if your beliefs are true. Therefore, we have reason to think our beliefs are probably true. But I'll say, look, on the free thinking argument against naturalism, it shows that your thoughts and beliefs are ultimately caused and determined by physics and chemistry, fizzing and popping.
Yeah.
That's not aimed at anything, right? So you don't have, your beliefs aren't aimed at truth. They're not even aimed at survival. Yeah. It's just, they're just random. They're not aimed at anything if physics and chemistry is running the show.
Yeah. Now I show that goal, and there is no real goal. So
that's right. That's right. And so that gets us then into the fine-tuning argument in the last chapter. And I show how we do need some teleology and a goal here, and that God has to create us with cognitive faculties and the ability to reason and what that entails and things like that. So now the problem is there for the Calvinist as well, or for the exhaustive divine determinist, because on an ed view, even though I'm shifting gears here because I'm going against the free-thinking argument against naturalism, but side note, if God is the one that causes and determines every belief, every thought and belief of every human all the time, then our thoughts and beliefs aren't aimed at truth either. They're aimed at God's will. And apparently, God wants most humans to hold false theological beliefs. In fact, I think everybody holds probably at least one false theological belief. And Calvinists can't even agree on everything. And so now, if God's will is for every human to hold false theological beliefs, at least some, now we don't have a justification or a reason to think that our theological beliefs, including that God exhaustively causally determines everything, is true. So anyway, I'll get back to the problem with naturalism here. I would say this: the significant problem for the determinist. Right here, I'm going to pick on the atheistic naturalist. It logically follows that if naturalism is true, then atheists, or anybody else for that matter, cannot possess justification for their beliefs, which most epistemologists would say is required for knowledge. And one can happen to have true beliefs. However, if they do not claim justification for a specific belief, then if justification is required for knowledge, then their belief does not qualify as a knowledge claim. And so with this in mind, if one cannot freely infer the best explanation, then one has no justification that their belief really is the best explanation. So without justification for a belief, a reason to think it's true, then any claim of reason-based knowledge regarding the said belief, it just goes down the drain or out the window or whatever. So all we're left with at that point is question-begging assumptions. Again, that assumption would be caused and determined by something else other than you. But question-begging assumptions are logical fallacies and thus are not reasons. That's not justification. It's not a reason to think anything is true. So here's the deal. Humans possess the ability to rationally infer knowledge claims. That's obvious. And to argue against that would affirm it because one would have to offer claims of knowledge to the contrary. And on top of that, think about this. If one rejects the ability to rationally affirm knowledge claims, then why should anybody listen to them? They're saying, I don't know anything. Anyway, let me give you a short, quick thought experiment that I use to help. I gave you a lot of philosophy there. I think this kind of makes it easy to understand. So this is what I call my mad scientist thought experiment. There's lots of mad scientist thought experiments out there. This one's mine. So suppose somehow, Bobby, that a mad scientist got control of your brain and everything that you think. So now he causally determines you. He causally determines all of your thoughts and beliefs all the time. So this now includes exactly what you think of and about and exactly how you think of and about it. So all of your thoughts and beliefs and all of your beliefs about your thoughts and all your thoughts about your beliefs, they're all caused and determined by the mad scientist. And this also includes the next words that are going to come out of your mouth and even the next words that are going through your head, right? All of those words are caused and determined by the mad scientist. So question, Bobby, how can you, Bobby Conway, not the mad scientist, rationally affirm the current beliefs in your head as good, bad, better, the best, true, or probably true? Note the range of options from which to choose. How can you choose one of those without begging the question if the mad scientist is going to causally determine the next words out of your mouth? Go.
Yeah, I'm hosed, bro.
Yeah, you're hosed, right?
I'm hosed. Yeah, I do. I think I've heard you use this before, and I've read it before, and I think it's compelling. I really do. I think you put people in a bind right there, and you have to chew on that for a little bit and think about that. And I think that really goes to back up as a thought experiment the case that you're already building with your philosophical argument.
And so I just say this: you replace that mad scientist with physics and chemistry, or you replace the mad scientist with God or anything else, and you got the exact same rationality problems, but for different reasons.
Yeah. No, that's good, Tim. Okay, so as we've talked through a lot of the philosophical backing as it relates to Molinism, your claim is that this can split, the horns of the dilemma as a viewpoint to pick up. You used to be a Calvinist. Now you're a Molinist, president and founder, Free Thinking Ministries. You did your PhD in systematic theology on this work. Your book's out now, #1 on Amazon, and Philosophy of Religion. Encourage people to go and get it. Let's deal with some of the biblical data.
Okay.
Can you give us an argument for libertarian freedom based on the biblical data?
Yeah. Here's my syllogism. It's just a 3-step syllogism now. 2 premises, 1 conclusion. Premise 1, if Christians possess the ability to choose among a range of options, each consistent and compatible with their natures, then they possess libertarian freedom. Premise 2, Christians possess the ability to choose between giving into temptation or to take the way of escape God promises to provide in 1 Corinthians 10:13. Therefore, Christians possess libertarian freedom. So, the first premise simply defines what is meant by libertarian freedom, and that's the only premise in which the determined determinist is left to attack is the second. However, this puts the divine determinist in an awkward and an uncomfortable position if he is also claiming to be a Bible-believing Christian, because the Christian who rejects premise 2 then opposes a plain and common sense interpretation of the Apostle Paul's words. And since God then seems to have provided at least some people, Christians here, is, in 1 Corinthians, his target audience was Christians. So I'm not saying this applies to everybody. I'm just saying, hey, at least Paul's audience, these Christians here, have an ability not to sin. So Christians, therefore, are able not to fall into temptation, but Christians still sin, right? So it logically follows that whenever a Christian does commit a sin, he didn't have to. He didn't have to miss the mark because there was a genuine ability for him to do otherwise. Paul calls it a way of escape, and this is exactly what is meant by libertarian freedom. You could sin or not sin. And so, Paul's clear. God promises to provide this way of escape. So at least Christians, when we do still sin, we could have done otherwise. The Christian possesses the ability to choose between or among a range of alternative options, in this case, to sin or not to sin. Both of these options are consistent and compatible with our regenerated nature, right? So it follows that when a Christian freely chooses to sin, he was able not to sin. It follows then that he's genuinely responsible for his sin, and he's got libertarian freedom. And so I say, don't say the devil made me do it. And whatever you do, don't say God made me do it. You're responsible. God gave you a way out, a way of escape, and you failed to take it. Therefore, you're responsible and you need to repent. But since premise 1 is true by definition and premise 2 is supported by the inspired word of God, Christians have good reason. We've got biblical reason to affirm limited libertarian freedom. That just means libertarian freedom in some things, some of the time. It doesn't mean I've got libertarian freedom all the time. It just means that on occasion I've got it. So that is to say that the Bible is clear that at least some people possess the ability to choose between or among a range of alternative options that are each consistent and compatible with our image of God natures. Our natures are still given to us by God. They're determined by God. I just argue that God has given us a nature like his that can sometimes choose between or among a range of options, each compatible with our nature. So to say it another way, I'll just say it like this. By God's grace, Christians can freely choose to sin or take the way of escape promised by God. Therefore, Christians possess libertarian free will. And I give some other scriptures in there too to make different cases. But I like to start with that one.
Yeah, I think 1 Corinthians 10:13, that's a great verse. First verse I ever memorized as a Christian. And, again, we have the freedom to do otherwise. But what's great being Christians is we also have a resource in God where, he's not coercing us, but he's there to come and help us when we look to him. And that's a comfort to me. So you've given a biblical piece of data, 1 Corinthians 10:13, to kind of, reinforce libertarian freedom. Maybe as we wrap up, give one example of God in his middle knowledge from maybe the Old Testament or the New Testament for our listeners.
Oh, let's see. Well, so let's think of. I've got so many I want to. I would say when David prays, or David's asking God, what would happen if I stick around? And yes. God says, if you stick around, you're hosed. So David gets the heck out of Dodge, and it doesn't happen, right? So, yes. So it didn't happen, but God gave David he told him what would happen if he did it. And now that's not middle knowledge. That's counterfactual knowledge. So middle knowledge takes place logically prior to God's creative decree. So there's multiple places in Scripture where it's clear that God has counterfactual knowledge. So then the question is, does a maximally great being possess counterfactual knowledge logically prior to his creative decree? And if God is necessarily omniscient, then I argue that, of course he would. And I do have arguments in the book based on maximal greatness and stuff that would make that case as well.
So, Tim, thank you so much. I want to bring Tim Holland, our executive producer. We went a little bit longer because we got off to a late start, but I didn't know if there was a question or two that we wanted to present to Tim with our time, or if we just need to land the plane. We didn't agree on our end time today, but I do want to say thank you, Tim Stratton, for laying out this argument. We walked through it, and it's the kind of thing that people can go and listen to. We will take this argument, Tim, and the different questions that we asked you, and we'll put them in smaller clips. So we'll make more videos of this.
Cool.
We'll also put it on a podcast at 1 Minute Apologist, whereby people who don't have time to watch can listen to it. But I do think it takes time to learn theology. And this is an argument here that you were developing. And so it's a little bit, if you're a listener of 1 Minute Apologist each week, it's a little bit more organic typically, but we really wanted you to hear the structure in the way that Tim laid this out. And so that's why we were a little bit more careful. So Tim Hull, any words for us, bro?
Sure. Yeah, there's lots of questions. Tim Stratton, fantastic job. Man, my head is spinning with a bunch of questions, but I won't monopolize this question and answer time with my questions. I will ask a few of them from the chat. I thought one that was really good came in from Vince, and Vince asked, if Judas was placed in a different circumstance, would he have sinned against Jesus, or was it preordained for the scriptures according to Molinism?
Well, God would know if Judas would have chosen differently or not. I don't know. But it was preordained and predestined in the sense that God knew that if he created this world, that Judas would betray Jesus. And so then when he created the world, he knew that Judas would freely betray Jesus. So yeah, I mean, Molinism is huge when it comes to predestination. We affirm it. Look, I affirm exhaustive divine predestination. I reject exhaustive divine determinism. And the problem is so many people conflate improperly predestination with causal determinism. And in my book, I have an argument that deductively concludes, therefore, predestination and causal determinism ought not be conflated. So you'll have to get the book and read that syllogism. I just gave you the conclusion. But they are not the same thing. But I affirm predestination across the board.
No, that's awesome. I was having this almost exact conversation with somebody on the worship team a few weeks ago at church, and it was great to kind of just the passerbyers would sit down and they were, what are you guys talking about? And we try to sum it up, and then we get back into the conversation. So I'm excited to forward your conversation tonight with Bobby to him, and we'll continue on that dialogue. So a few more quick questions here. Jonathan asks, he said, thank you for this. In which ways do you differ with Dr. Craig's view on Molinism? So where do you and Dr. Craig find some differences on your view of Molinism, if any?
I'm not aware of any real differences. We disagree on very few things. In fact, I wrote an article kind of joking about how Dr. Craig and I agree on so many things. About the only thing that we have found that we really disagree is on, okay, we both agree that the B theory of time is false, but we disagree on what would follow if the B theory of time were true. And I think that's about all we can find to disagree on right now of any consequence. So, regarding Molinism, I'd have to think about that. I really would have to say I stood on his shoulders for so much of this, and also Kirk McGregor and John David Lang, Kenneth Keithley. I mean, these are some other brilliant Molinists that have gone on in front of me, and I'm also just surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses who are all Molinists also. So many good friends. We have many conversations, sometimes heated debates. We don't always disagree on everything, or we don't always agree on everything. And And it's just really an iron sharpening iron. But all these people, and including really Dr. Craig. I mean, Dr. Craig said it on the back of the book. He said he's always hoped to see somebody take his work, make it their own, expand upon it, and run with it. And he says that that's what I've done here. And so I really stood on the shoulders of giants, and he was probably the biggest giant of them all. And at least off the top of my head, I can't think of anything that we would really disagree on regarding Molinism, but I'm sure we can find something.
Yeah, right. Well, and we can always find places to disagree. So I'll end with this question. I know that there's other questions, but I'm hoping this one really tees you up to pitch your book here. We've talked about it a number of times. We talked about some different arguments in there. But Andrew Green asks, does Stratton's book give a working understanding of Calvinism and Arminianism? Who is this book for, and does one need to have a working knowledge of those models, or is this kind of introductory? So who's this book for? Let's just start there and kind of go from there.
The book is for, let me read to you the first part of, so Kirk McGregor writes the foreword, and there it is. So he says, Dr. Tim Stratton has the rare and precious gift of taking highly complex issues in philosophical theology and making them easily understandable to lay people, at the same time as he shows their tremendous importance for scholars in the disciplines of philosophy and religion. This book will be profitably and enjoyably read by lay people and scholars interested in various themes, including biblical exegesis, the history of Christian thought, metaphysics, epistemology, systematic theology, and practical Christian living. So Kirk's foreword is awesome. I recommend people buy the book just to read Kirk's foreword. But I think the book is for, it's based on my PhD dissertation. Now, I wrote this dissertation at a Reformed university. So I was at Northwest University, Reformed theology department, and staunch Reformed. So it was like pulling teeth just to get my research proposal accepted. I almost gave up. I spent close to, it seemed like a year trying to get the research proposal accepted. And at one point I thought I either have to go a different route and choose a different topic because they did not want me to argue for libertarian freedom or Molinism. I either have to take a different route or quit and go somewhere else. Finally, one professor said, because I was saying, I think I can show how Molinism and Calvinism and even Reformed theology are all compatible. And he said, win me over. And I finally, I guess, did the job, won him over. And he said, okay, I'll be your supervisor. And but then I was worried, man, as we were getting closer to the dissertation going to the committee, I was like, man, I don't know if I'm going to pass. I mean, Bobby, I remember talking to you about this in Israel. I was really worried because I just did not know if a Reformed theology department was going to pass me. But one of the guys on the committee said that it was the best, or at least one of the best dissertations he's ever graded. So I wrote this at an academic level, but at the same time, I have a passion as a former youth pastor to try to bring things down to the streets, right? I like to take things from the ivory towers of academia and bring them down to the streets for everybody to enjoy. So I tried hard, and Kirk McGregor seems to think that I did that. So I think if you're out there and you take theology seriously, even if you're a layperson, even if you've never studied deep theology, but you want to take your theology seriously, I think you can handle this.
Well, no, that's great. And again, I really appreciate all of the insight that you gave tonight. It's available on Kindle as well. I did see that today that you posted that it's on Kindle for $10. So, right. Man, there's a good chance that I'll pick that up on Kindle and have Siri read it to me because I like to listen to books. I know Bobby likes to listen to books as well. Mm-hmm. So, Bobby, any final thoughts, man? I know that there's lots of chat. We had a Planting Us Bulldog is in the chat asking some great questions. Shannon had another great question. But, man, if we keep going on with questions. Apologetics Squared had some good questions as well. Sorry, I just don't think we're going to be able to get to all these questions. We've gone almost an hour and 40 minutes here, and we probably should wrap it up before somebody falls asleep on us or whatnot. So, Bobby, any final closing thoughts you want to wrap us up with?
Yeah, I mean, I would say on one side, it'd be good when we have a lot of questions and we can't address, just we can extract them, and then we can always have Tim on for a future Q&A follow-up. I would say if you're looking for a great stocking stuffer for your kindergartner or preschool kids, be sure to get Tim's book.
Well, it's got a pretty cover. I mean, the colors are.
It does.
Yeah. Tim, I want to see by the end of the week a preschooler on the playground reading a copy of your book.
Okay.
I'll challenge accepted. I have a kindergartner. I'll get her to put a book in her hand and Photoshop it in for you. Yeah.
Awesome.
But in all seriousness, I would say this is a piece I would encourage you to get. Maybe go through it as a small group. If you got a group of people that want to think about things intellectually, go through it as a group. Each get a copy of this. Take your time. Tim's been working on this for years, so don't feel discouraged if you listen today and you're thinking, what did we just talk about? Tim said at the outset, it can be a little bit heady as you're getting into it, but it really does elucidate, clarify, crystallize, in my opinion, a lot of the questions that can hang you up maybe as a Calvinist or an Arminian. And I'm just so thankful for this third option. And I thank you, Tim, for your ministry. And I love you, brother. And I wish you all the best.
Well, thanks, guys. Love you guys too. And thanks for having me on the show. Had a great time. And I guess, Bobby, now you'll be the 1 hour and 40 minute apologist.
Dude, I'm telling you, it can happen, baby. We can go long. We can go long. We've got it happening.
Yeah.
Till next time, Stratton.
All right.
Peace out.